Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Lauren Stewart from BookNet. Welcome to the Book Industry State of the Nation 2025. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis. The original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all of that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. If during the presentation you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. And let's get started. In this presentation, I'm going to be using data from a number of sources that we have access to at BookNet. You will see data from B&C sales data through this presentation, including in an annual publication called the Canadian Book Market. Sales data collects weekly point of sales data from retail outlets across Canada and includes chain and independent bookstores, newsstands, general retailers, online retailers, library wholesalers, and more. Based on publisher feedback, we estimate that B&C sales data represents 85% of book industry sales for English language print trade books. Other markets, such as direct institutional sales to schools or college university textbook sales, are not included. Except in certain instances, we'll use what we call comparable stores data from sales data. Comparable stores are a fixed group of retailers that have reported sales consistently for a number of years. When we aggregate their sales, we provide a more accurate view of the year-over-year market and individual category fluctuations that are not skewed by the addition of any new reporting retailers. The comparable stores represent about 98% of all markets in 2024. Data featured from BookNet Canada's Canadian Book Consumer Survey comes from a survey of Canadians and Canadian book consumers. This quarterly survey asks Canadians about their book buying, borrowing, and other book-related behaviors. Finally, our Canadian Leisure and Reading Survey provides insight into the reading behaviors of Canadians and is fielded annually, most recently in January 2025, when we surveyed Canadians over the age of 18 until we had responses from over 1,000 people who have read at least one book in 2024. If you're interested in learning more about any of these data sources or to read some reports, You can use the QR codes on this slide to access links for each, and you'll also see links throughout the presentation. My colleagues have also dropped a document in the chat where you can view them as well. Since the last time we gave this presentation, that was back in April 2024, a lot has happened at BookNet since then, and a lot has happened in the larger world. So the state of the nation won't be all rainbows and unicorns given everything. Since we last met with you, there have been a number of events impacting the Canadian publishing landscape. To name but a few, in no particular order, we've seen changes to governance and policies at select national retailers, continued strain on North American printing and publishing capacity, consumer hesitancy and a cost of living crisis, federal elections on both sides of the border, a Canada Post strike in the lead up to the December 2024 holiday sales period, and subsequent work to rule that has carried right up to the present, major strikes at both the West Coast and Montreal ports, changes to GST levied on books and non-book items for 10 weeks starting in December 2024. And top of mind for many since the US inauguration in January 2025, a heightened trade environment impacting the global supply chain for books. So here we are, over 430 days since we last met to discuss the state of the nation, navigating through a polycrisis. I'm left to think about a lyric from the musical Hamilton. In the eye of a hurricane, there is quiet. For just a moment, a yellow sky. I hope that today I can offer you some quiet. Encapsulating the last year plus into a single term is challenging. While it's very tempting to look back and see the joy of Taylor Swift completing the Eras Tour on Canadian soil as the feel-good representation of the last year, I'm afraid my more pragmatic mind looks to the complexity surrounding us. I feel this can only be defined as a polycrisis, a complex situation where multiple, interconnected crises converge and amplify each other, resulting in a predicament that's difficult to manage or resolve. I first started applying this term when analyzing the 2024-2025 GST holiday. Remember that? It's hard to believe that we finished that a little over 5 months ago. I'd like to revisit that as a perfect case study of why we do data science and perhaps why legislation may not always have the intended effect. Let's spend some time with sales data from December 2024 into February 2025. Should this presentation ever become a historical document, let's just make sure we have all of our dates lined up. The GST holiday was announced on November 21st with a start date of December 14th. It covers a large swath of products, several of which are tracked in B&C sales data, such as physical books, jigsaw puzzles, and some children's toys, as long as they reported to us using ISBNs and have corresponding bibliographic data in our database, we were able to track them. Before I share some of the data and analysis that we've worked on, I will flag that analysis on this topic is challenging, and there will surely be a lot of bad data science that comes out after this holiday is all said and done when legislators and other thought makers are looking back to this time. I invite you to recall the definition of the polycrisis from the previous slide, the simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events. It is precisely because of the several overlapping issues that occurred over the same period that makes it very challenging to isolate out the impact of the GST holiday on consumer book buying. I listed a number of those issues on this slide, and the major ones are ones that you'll be familiar with: the Canada Post strike, strikes at the ports in BC and Montreal, the existing overlap of the pre-Christmas sales window, plus a later than usual Black Friday and Cyber Monday shopping weekend that compress the holiday shopping window further, as well as the prevailing negative consumer attitude that I alluded to earlier in the presentation, where consumers have been conservative with their spending and are recoiling from the pandemic revenge spend that was observed starting in 2021. There also wasn't a massive bestseller in fall 2024 that drove people to bookstores the way that Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros did back in 2023. I will also note that sales reporting for this window is challenging because of where the start and end date of the GST holiday window falls in comparison years, namely where the start of the period falls, December 15th. Reporting in sales data is on a weekly basis, and the comparison weeks look a little different year over year. So what I am not willing to do is to do what RBC Economics has done with this slide, which is state definitively that the federal tax holiday delayed some holiday spending. That is a correlation and causation fallacy that I'm personally not willing to commit. In this graph, we're looking at the 2024 and 2025 GST holiday window in dark blue, and the equivalent time period in 2023-2024, the previous year, in teal. When you compare the two periods, 2023-2024 to 2024-2025, overall, you can see consumers largely responded with the same buying behavior as in previous years, a traditional rise in spending the weeks leading up to Christmas and Boxing Day, with a predictable decline into January and February. However, once you crunch the numbers, sales are up 5.38% year over year for this period. However, once you look at the weeks following Boxing Days, sales are actually up 11.69% compared to the 2023-2024 window. Because of the discomfort that I mentioned earlier with the causation and correlation fallacy, our research team added a question about the GST holiday in our Canadian book consumer study. We asked, what made you decide to buy this book? One of the answer options was low price due to the Government of Canada's GST HST relief for physical books. Responses came back that 8.4% identified this as at least one motivation for purchasing at least one book in December 2024, but that's only about 2% of all purchased ISBNs. All things considered, it really doesn't appear that the GST and HST relief for physical books had a major influence on consumer book purchases in the period. While there are any number of criticisms about the GST and HST relief initiative and the intention behind it, it is certain that Canadian consumers were in need of relief. One study that I have been watching for several years now is the Bank of Canada's Canadian Survey of Consumer Expectations. Released quarterly, this survey and interactive digital report reports on Canadian consumers' attitudes and experiences as they relate to any number of economic factors of the past quarter. The slide features the results from the first quarter of 2025, released in early April. We're about 2 weeks away from the next update in July. The results from the first quarter are characterized by pervasive uncertainty created by the sudden and unpredictable shifts in US trade policy. But hold on that, we'll be talking about tariffs shortly. Unfortunately, after decreasing for several quarters, the share of consumers who plan to reduce or postpone purchases has increased because of their inflation and interest rate expectations due to this same trade environment. Consumers are also more worried than last quarter about losing their job, which will also have a negative impact on spending. A new question in the most recent report looked at consumer habits around buying Canadian goods. As you can see from the chart on this slide, more than half of consumers plan to buy Canadian rather than US goods because of the trade conflict. Of course, this aligned with many of the conversations we have all been seeing in the news and on social media, and we at BookNet are interested in seeing how Canadian books were performing, so we've turned to sales data. While we don't have 2025's early Canadian book consumer study results in quite yet, we can look to the 2024 annual results to see how Canadian book buyers searched for books, an interesting figure that may prove insightful when we compare to the forthcoming 2025 results. Stay tuned for those. In 2024, Canadian book buyers continued to search for a wide variety of books, including books by Canadian authors and illustrators at 32% of respondents, books about Canada or regions within Canada at 27% of respondents, and books about a group or culture written by people from that group or culture at 22%. So let's go back to sales data. On this slide, you can see a graph of Canadian contributors' book sales as a percentage of total sales, captured by the solid teal line with its peaks and valleys. There is also a trend line imposed on the graph, which indicates a steady upward trajectory from the first week of sales in January to where we sit currently at the end of June. Following discourse on social media, the Buy Canadian movement kicked up in earnest in early and mid-March 2025. That peak that you're seeing in the middle of May, perhaps fortuitously close to Mother's Day, That's our girl Carly Fortune, whose distinctly Canadian romances have been capturing Canadian readers since the release of Every Summer After in 2022. Her new release, One Golden Summer, saw Canadian contributor sales reach their highest percentage of all sales to date at approximately 16.8% in the week of its release. Some of you will remember these statistics, which are total sales for Canadian contributors and the percentage of their market share of all units sold in the year. This bar graph contains data from sales data with the 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024 years compared. As of today, we only have completed 25 weeks of our 2025 year and have a lot of ground to cover until the end of the year, including the award and holiday boost in the final months. Therefore, I haven't included the total unit sales for 2025, but I have included a percentage of the total market that Canadian contributors represent to date. Looking at the total sales for the year to date, Canadian contributors have captured approximately 11.86% of total sales in the market. I'll only spend a bit longer on 2024, and I'll warn that some of these numbers are a touch sobering. Here you are seeing top-level figures from the Canadian book market 2024, our report that was released in March. BookNet Canada produces this annual report as a part of our commitment to provide members of the book supply chain with the information they need to innovate and compete in today's market. In the 2024 report, the Canadian English print market, tracked through BNC sales data, recorded just about 48 million units sold, down from 49 million units sold in 2023 and 52 million units sold in 2022. These sales totaled approximately $1.1 billion in Canadian, which is slightly less than half of Taylor Swift's net worth. You'll also see a figure of 878,000 ISBNs tracked across those 48 million units sold, which is an increase from 847,000 in 2023. So the long tail grows. And a good thing that the long tail does indeed grow, as it's pulling its weight. Each column on this bar graph represents a percentage of units sold from 2019 and 2024, insofar as frontlist, published within the year being measured, and backlist is concerned. We observed last year that 2023 was looking a lot like pre-pandemic levels back in 2019, and perhaps this is now leveling off as we are seeing similar numbers for 2024. Moving forward, each column on this bar graph represents total sales in millions of units from 2020 over to 2024, respectively. That downward trend is alarming, so I should note that there is the possibility that sales may be happening in channels or formats that we don't get data reported for, which is why we always want to work closely with publishers to fill the gaps so sales data has an ever increasingly complete view of the industry. This chart looks at the percentage change in unit sales versus the prior year. You can see the impacts of the pandemic quite clearly here, where in 2021, the year-over-year performance was offset by the retail phenomenon of revenge spending, where consumers emerged from COVID-19 and opened their wallets to spend more freely. That enthusiasm has waned in the subsequent years and also tempered by the cost of living crisis and corresponding consumer hesitancy, as discussed earlier. Here I've also included a category breakdown. You'll see that there were slight gains in the fiction category year over year, but overall reductions due to reductions in the nonfiction, juvenile, and young adult categories. On this slide, you're seeing a year-over-year comparison of the print book market from 2023 to 2024 for the US market, courtesy of BookScan, and Canada from sales data, the same units presented on the last slide. While the overall Canadian market suffered year over year in terms of unit sales, the US market was able to offset reductions in the nonfiction, juvenile, and young adult areas, similar to reductions that we saw, with an even stronger showing in fiction. But enough with the 2023 to 2024 full year comparisons. Let's look at what we have so far for calendar 2025 compared to the same period in 2024 and beyond. This is 25 weeks of sales. Pulling back to the whole market of sales, we have a slide here that compares unit sales for year to date against the same period last year. 2025 to date is in gray and 2024 in orange. You will notice several weeks where 2025 in gray outperforms the same period in 2024 in orange. Indeed, 2025 sales are beating 2024's by a little over 4% currently. And we can add in additional years for greater context. Here we've added 2023, 2022, 2021, and 2020, and finally 2019. That 4% increase year over year from 2024 is encouraging, especially as many of the previous year-over-year comparisons between 2023 and 2024, for example, have been challenging. For some fun, I've dropped the top 10 bestsellers of 25 so far, with strong showings from the juvenile and young adult fiction categories to balance out Rebecca Yaros's sustained presence on the list since the debut of Iron Flame in 2023. 4 of the top 10 books were published in 2025, and the top 10 features one Canadian author, Greta Podleski. Filter the bestseller list by Canadian contributors, and we see Greta joined by worthy peers such as Mark Carney with his 2021 release Values, which has received renewed interest this year, as well as several names familiar to the bestseller list: Robert Munsch, Margaret Atwood, and of course, Carly Fortune. Of this mid-year list, 6 of the top 10 books were published in 2025. Let's return to some more consumer paneling. In this chart, which records the percentage of respondents who replied to our Canadian leisure and reading study in 2024 that they, yes, read a book for leisure in the last year, we can see that only 78% of survey respondents read a book in 2024, a slight decrease from 2025, and a return to survey lows since we started capturing this figure in 2013. Sorry, I need a drink. Sorry about that. You would think with the heat and humidity, one would not be so parched. Canadians are using their leisure time in 2024 much as the same as they did in 2023. The top 10 leisure and recreational activities done by Canadians at least weekly in 2024 are on this slide, with reading or listening to books moving up one spot and jumping from 49% in 2023 to 52% in 2024. This is the good news story. More Canadians are turning to books in their free time. Here as well, reading or listening to books as a daily leisure choice moved up a spot and increased 3% year over year. The remaining order of the list hasn't changed significantly from 2023. Now back to consumer hesitancy. Given the reports of a cost of living crisis plaguing Canadians in 2024, we were especially attuned to Canadians' perception of value in terms of the money they spent on books. In terms of spending on leisure activities, including books, in a given month, most Canadian readers spent between $1 and $49, 20%, or between $50 and $99, 21%. The third largest share spent between $100 and $149 per month at 18%. In 2024, fewer Canadians spent nothing in a typical month than they did in 2023, and more spent between $1 and $149 as seen in the graph below. It's a notable shift in spending at a time when cost of living is rising. It will be interesting to see how and if this changes in 2025. When we narrow down leisure spending to just book purchases, we found that readers are spending much of the same amounts in 2024 as they did in 2023. The largest share of readers spent between $1 and $49 per month on books at 37%. 26% didn't spend any money, and 15% spent between $50 and $99. Though the changes in spending habits for readers in 2024 compared with 2023 were not big ones, we do see changes in how they answered questions about their budget for books. More readers said they chose books within their budget in 2024 at 46% than in 2023, 44%, or 2022, 40%. And fewer readers had no restrictions on the books they bought, 23% in each of 2024 and 2023, down from 30% in 2022. Readers were likely to spend more on print books than other formats. Once the threshold was $50 or above, print books either tied or came out ahead in each tier of spending. Readers were more likely to spend nothing on ebooks, 17%, than any other format. More concerning was affordability, or perceptions of such. Readers were less likely to say they got good value for the price they paid in 2024 than they were in 2023. With that context firmly in hand and feedback from retailers indicating that list prices are top of mind to respond to consumer hesitancy, we wanted to understand consumers' attitude around list prices. Affordability plays a particularly strong role in influencing format choice. According to the Canadian Leisure and Reading Study in 2024, when deciding to purchase a book, 48% of print readers and 46% in 2023, 39% of ebook readers, 37% in 2023, and 32% of audiobook listeners, 34% in 2023, said affordability was important. With that context firmly in hand and feedback from retailers again indicating that pricing is at top of mind, let's look at those list prices. According to the Canadian book market in 2024, median list prices increased across most formats and genres between 2020 and 2024. The largest price gains were seen in juvenile, young adult, fiction, trade paper formats, as well as nonfiction hardcovers. But there were two notable exceptions. YA titles and nonfiction mass market books remained stable in price over the same period. If the thought of so many rising prices when consumers are hesitant about their spending causes you to reach for a beta blocker, there is some comfort to be found. Even amidst rising prices, 85% of readers said that they felt they received good value for the money they spent on the books they bought in 2024, according to both the Canadian Book Consumer Study and the Canadian Leisure and Reading Study. If this line of inquiry is of interest to you, I recommend that you seek out a recent blog post that we shared titled Discounts, Data, and Decisions, Navigating Hesitant Consumer Spending. You can see the link on the screen. Are readers still buying books new? How important is affordability when choosing a book? And what does this mean for publishers trying to navigate this cautious consumer landscape? We answer these questions using insights from sales data, the Canadian book consumer, the Canadian book market, and the Canadian Leisure and Reading Study. So I can't get into all 36 pages of the completed leisure study. I highly encourage you to check it out. I wanted to end on an insight about the sustainability preferences of readers, as I think it's something on all of our minds as we grapple with new supply chain realities in 2025. Print readers show strong preferences for environmental considerations around their books, with 71% wanting books to be made from sustainably sourced paper, 69% donating or giving away a print book after they finish reading it, and 67% wanting their books delivered in ecological friendly packaging. Perhaps the most interesting response was the 50% of respondents who agreed that they wanted to know where books are printed or shipped from. While we conceived of this question in relation to the environmental impact before the inauguration in January, the economic situation with the ever-evolving US tariff situation may bring another dimension to responses in the future, and we'll be keeping an eye on this. We've covered a fair bit today, and I wanted to leave you also with a graph that has proven provocative and one that I revisit regularly. 54% of all book purchases made by Canadian book buyers surveyed in our Canadian Book Consumer Study in 2024 were online, while 46% were in person at bricks and mortar stores or physical stores. You can see the impact of the COVID lockdowns in the 2020 and 2021 period and the move back to what things looked like before the pandemic, where the gap between online and physical bookstores narrowed in 2022 and 2023. However, we haven't quite got back to 2019's pre-pandemic levels, and we even saw a little growth in online again in Q4 of 2023 and Q1 of 2024. We'll continue to keep an eye on this and report back. Any discussion of online book purchasing naturally invites an examination of formats purchased. This chart compares 2019 to 2024 in terms of the formats the respondents confirmed they purchased. The growth of paperbacks observed in 2023 did not hold through to 2024, where it has now matched pre-pandemic levels. Hardbacks have remained relatively resilient despite overlapping consumer concerns about affordability and sustainability. For our final survey, we have turned to you, BookNet's products and service audience. Earlier this year, we wrapped up our annual consumer survey where we asked you what issues were at front of mind. We've grouped some of these responses here and ranked based on number of responses. First up was the health and longevity of independent Canadian businesses, including retailers and publishers, but I interpret this as extending more broadly across the supply chain to include domestic distributors, wholesalers, and etc. With the current heightened trade environment adding an element of risk and uncertainty for all businesses, the smaller players are exposed to greater risk because of their size, which only exacerbates the pre-existing challenges, such as consumer hesitancy. Second on the list, in your feedback, was matters relating to AI, including copyright, intellectual freedom, artistic and creative integrity, and impacts to our workforce in the industry. Third, were considerations about printing capacity and affordability. I'd also include matters relating to environmental impact and social responsibility as the publishing supply chain works towards increasingly sustainable practices in lockstep with rising consumer expectations. Fourth, tariffs, which is indeed turning into the story of 2025 as the sitting president of the United States continues to levy unpredictable changes to established trade protocols. We have already seen a renewed interest in a buy Canadian consumer spending movement, as well as a realignment of Canadian trade relationships with the US, where intra-provincial trade barriers are being removed and new trade opportunities identified with other international partners to encourage Canadian self-reliance and diversify revenue sources to reduce an over-reliance on the US. I encourage you to check out a recent post by Lever Canada Books on the topic, and we'll put a link in the chat. Finally, we have pricing. Voices from the retail sector have been clear in their assertions that consumer hesitancy suggests that list prices are too high, and some of the research shared in this presentation and on our blog discusses this head on. However, lowering list prices may address consumer hesitancy while exposing the supply chain to risk via tighter margins. Greater analysis is needed to define what one person asked as the quote-unquote right prices in 2025. That's all we have for you today, and I'm happy to take any questions since we have some time. If you have any questions you'd like to answer over email, I have put up the research email. Feel free to reach out, and remember to sign up to our newsletter for up-to-date research information. I'm just navigating over to your questions now. Just give me a moment, please. Okay, I have a question from the audience here where it says, apologies if I missed this in the presentation, but is there data available for Canadian published titles as opposed to Canadian authored titles? So there is a question of process in answering that question. So in short, yes, there is data available for this. The long form answer is it is quite challenging to pull with a degree of certainty. Where we at BookNet are quite confident that publishers and the larger supply chain have responded quite well, strongly, to identifying Canadian contributors in metadata, there isn't currently a metadata standard that identifies Canadian publishers. So right now, BookNet, as well as other data sources and aggregators, have to maintain these lists manually, updating and making sure that any Canadian entities that pop up or change hands are properly identified in these manual tracking lists. Because of that challenge and the possible gaps that it introduced from a manual process, BookNet has been tasked by our Canadian Bibliographic Committee to identify a way of defining Canadian publishers in metadata, and we are working through this in current meetings as well as meetings that have been occurring throughout 2024. So hopefully we'll have an update for that soon in terms of a metadata response, which would make it easier upon pickup by data providers to actually do this analysis. There's a question here, to what extent do you think consumers are aware of whether a book is Canadian, given the multinationals don't necessarily market? I think that this is an interesting question because of varying definitions of what the extent of a book is Canadian or perhaps less so. Consumers are intelligent. They are able to look and seek for the data that they are looking for to make purchasing decisions. They have the power of the internet behind them. They're also, in every book, there is that title page, which will give them information about the publisher's origins in terms of location, as well as where the book has been copywritten, where it has been printed, where it has the office of the publisher is, and then, of course, the biographical information about the author. So there is information available to consumers. Whether or not they agree with a definition that perhaps one person or another person or all the people on this call may not agree with in terms of what is a Canadian, that is another thing. But we can see that they are interested in purchasing Canadian authors and illustrators. There's a question that just showed up and it kind of relates to what I just talked about. So I'll move to that. Sorry for others that are waiting in the queue. What other metadata challenges prevent BookNet from doing further analysis about the sales and performance of the market? Usually where the challenges around metadata are that the standards are constantly changing, and therefore it requires software providers, such as those software providers that allow publishers to create metadata records and distribute them across the supply chain, as well as the publishers themselves needing to acquire education and ensure that they're up to date with information. That is generally the challenge in an evolving standard, a standard that is not static. So when there are excellent new standards that are introduced for things that would benefit things like tracking, say, Canadian publishers, it will take some time for that to become sticky in the marketplace. There would need to be a critical number of influential data recipients looking to ingest that data, as well as ready and able publisher suppliers using systems that support these standards. So that's usually the chokehold there, is the problem between human and technical resources. I hope that answers that question. How can we access similar sales data throughout the year? That's a great question. For those of you who are sales data subscribers, you'll find a perhaps not well-known feature of the sales data subscription is that you can see a monthly market report that is available through the homepage when you log into sales data. But then there is also broader research that is available continuously, almost on a bi-weekly basis through our blog. I'll ask my colleagues to perhaps drop a link in the chat to the research and analysis tab in the BNC blog. There's also a great way, if you just want to be notified, you can sign up to our various newsletters, which is very helpful to get those things directly delivered to your mailbox upon release. And I would recommend that if you're trying to stay on top of things. We also occasionally will partner with our member associations to deliver research that meets their needs and identifies particular lines of inquiry that have been flagged by their staff or their board members. So there's lots of different channels. Also, you can contact us. That research, I believe it's still on. I can't see my slide, but I hope it's still on the screen. research@booknetcanada.ca. If you're interested in something, we want to be interested in it. So let us know what you're thinking, and we're happy to kind of dig into things. And if there's ever anything we can't share, we'll just let you know if we don't have that information. Okay. Sorry, just navigating through my document here. Do we have any information on trends regarding sales for self/indie published books versus traditionally published books? We currently at BookNet do not have what I would say would be a reliable way to track this. There actually is a way to identify self-published authors or independent presses in metadata. You could use, everyone here has probably heard of BISAC subject codes that look at subject and genres of books. BISAC also has two sister lists. One are regional themes and the other is merchandising themes. In the merchandising theme list, there is a section of codes related to publisher type. So if you are supporting BISAC merchandising themes, which as we understand, most systems are able to both provide that information as well as ingest it in the form of retail or other downstream data recipients, you could support and identify self-published and independently published books via that merchandising theme. However, right now, merchandising themes represent a very, very small percentage of subjects provided in the subject composite when we last checked through BNC BiblioShare, our data aggregation service. So that is challenging to track reliably. It would be very manual at this point unless we had kind of consistent application of identifiers like that merchandising code. So unfortunately, that's a tricky one. Just move down. Okay. Yes, BookNet does release similar data focused on book borrowing. I will confess that I did not include a lot about book borrowing on this presentation because I was trying to focus on the market, the sales market, and given all of the information about tariffs and about the GST holiday and things like that that have had an impact on sales this year, I did not include that. However, you can look forward to our blog in a few weeks. We will have a half-year update that will look at both sales as well as library checkouts and borrowing behavior. And so I would highly recommend keeping an eye out for that. Again, subscribing to our research newsletter or putting up an RSS tracker on that website, that kind of thing, and you should get that delivered to you. But you will see a fresh, updated information on library borrows soon. Okay, and then just, where is another? I saw there was another one from the audience. Maybe not. Oh, here's one right here. Are there any sales trends that BookNet is paying attention to? Currently, right now, we're spending a lot of time tracking the Buy Canadian impact, looking at, not only books at a granular level and perhaps very large releases that can impact the Buy Canadian trends, but as well as these larger pieces of how to identify Canadian books. Is it through publishing? Is it through print origin? Is it through distribution origin? All of these questions. So we're looking at buying Canadian and if there's alignment for other ways that we can ping that in addition to like looking at contributors. Another thing we're of course looking at is the impact of tariffs and if that is going to be impacting production, looking at the number of ISBNs that receive pub dates and releases in 2025, I think is something that we'll have to look at later this year. And we also are, of course, tracking those sales trends that pop up year over year. We're now, of course, in the age of romance and romantasy and new adult and all of these trends from the romance sector. So we're tracking all of those to see if those gains from 2023 are following through and lots of interesting things there. And every year around January and February, we have a Tech Forum presentation from our sales data team that looks at emerging trends. So we are constantly kind of watching and analyzing the data set to see if anything pops out. Where am I seeing? Oh, they're down in the list there. What can the industry do to better prepare for future crises? That's an interesting one. This may come as more personal, and I invite perhaps people to comment in the chat or in other avenues for this. But my feeling is that the work that was done around tariffs and what my colleagues have called cross-sector communication was really valuable and showed a level of communication and collaboration agnostic to the size of your company, to the incorporation of your company, to the influence of your company. And we saw a lot of excellent collaboration happening there from across the industry to address this kind of existential threat on Canadian cultural production. We also must tip our hats to the amazing advocacy that we are seeing out of so many industry groups. And I'll list some of BookNet's members as, particular lights in that regard: the Association of Canadian Publishers, the Canadian Publishers Council, the Canadian Independent Booksellers Association, Indigo Books and Music, the Canadian Book Wholesalers Association, as well as the Canadian Urban Libraries Council. All have done excellent work around advocacy to not only gather people together, but ensure that communication is happening and that there is resiliency that is being built outside of these times of crises as well. Another response that we're seeing directly happen is that several companies are now considering their whole supply chain and akin to the way that consumers are looking at it from a Buy Canadian perspective, where you're bringing in Canadian groceries, Canadian clothing, things of Canadian origin into your home, that we're also seeing the people who have influence and are able to address change within their company bring production and other supply elements, such as suppliers, back into the country. And so that's something that was being seen very quickly after the tariff situation started to bubble up, where people are analyzing their supply chains and trying to make some change there. So in terms of, you know, making the industry more resilient to respond to this particular crisis, that is one such way. Just looking to see if there are any more questions. I don't see anything right now. So I'm just going to wrap up. Let me just move on. I'm not sure if my slides are still visible, but I trust that my colleagues will let me know if something weird has happened. So before you go and wrap up your day, we would actually love it if you could provide feedback on this session. We're going to have a link to a survey in the chat, and it will also be emailed to you following today. Just take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to the recording of the session as once it's available. We'd also like to invite you to join our upcoming session, Audiobooks for Everyone, an Accessibility First Approach, scheduled for September 11th. Find information about all of these upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website at bnctechforum.ca. I'd also like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And as you trickle out and return to your day, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for attending and sharing your precious time with us today. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the loss of two of BookNet's leaders in the past year. In August 2024, we lost our President and CEO Emeritus, Noah Genner, and in April 2025, we lost our Director of Product Development, Jackie Fry. Noah was with BookNet for over 20 years and Jackie for over 17 years, and both of them are remarkable people and colleagues who deserve this time slot and more just for their book recommendations alone. Our lives and our work at BookNet were improved just by knowing them, and we miss them dearly. And thank you for the memories, Noah and Jackie. Thank you for being here and letting me honor their memory. Have a good day.